The controls aren't responding. We're going down.
Look at the sign, seat 7A. What about it?
The morning had started like any other for Captain James Mitchell. A thick cup of black coffee, a weather briefing, and the familiar pre-flight walk-around of the Boeing 777. He'd done this routine over 8,000 times in 28 years of flying. His face bore the weathered look of someone who'd spent half his life at 35,000 feet, deep lines around his eyes, salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm demeanor that came from having seen almost everything the sky could throw at him. Flight 447 from Denver to Chicago was supposed to be a straightforward 4-hour journey on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. Just another day at the office for one of the most decorated pilots in United Airlines' fleet. Captain Mitchell had an enviable safety record. Not a single incident in 28 years. No emergency landings, no mechanical failures that required anything more than routine maintenance, no passenger injuries under his command. His colleagues called him Lucky Jim, though Mitchell always insisted there was nothing lucky about it. Only preparation, attention to detail, and the kind of instinctive flying sense that couldn't be taught in any simulator. He'd trained hundreds of younger pilots over the years, and they all said the same thing. Mitchell made flying look easy because he understood the machine on a level that went beyond the instruments and manuals. The pre-flight checks had been perfect, everything by the book. His co-pilot, David Torres, a competent younger man with 6 years of experience, ran through the checklist with practiced precision. The aircraft was in top condition, only 1,200 flight hours since its last major overhaul, all systems green across the board. The weather forecast showed clear skies all the way to Chicago, with nothing but smooth air predicted. Even the passenger manifest looked light. Only 246 souls aboard instead of the usual 340, leaving plenty of empty seats and making for a comfortable flight. Mitchell had even joked with Torres that it would be a milk run, the kind of flight where you could practically fly on autopilot and still have a perfect landing. But somewhere around the 40-minute mark into the flight, as they cruised at 35,000 feet over western Kansas, things began to feel wrong. It started subtly, a vibration, nothing dramatic, just something that shouldn't be there. Mitchell felt it through the control yoke, a faint tremor that made his instincts fire like alarm bells. He immediately checked the engine readings. Everything was nominal. Engine temperatures, fuel flow rates, pressure indicators, all exactly where they should be. He exchanged a glance with Torres, who shrugged. "Did you feel that?" Mitchell asked. "Feel what?" Torres replied. "Everything's reading normal." But it wasn't normal. Mitchell had been flying long enough to know the difference between what the instruments said and what a plane was actually telling you. Instruments could be deceived. The aircraft's vibration didn't lie. He pulled up the diagnostic system and ran a full system check, a procedure that took several minutes and should have revealed any mechanical anomalies. All systems green. Then, without warning, the hydraulic pressure indicator on the left side of the instrument panel flickered, just for a second, a ghost in the machine. Mitchell leaned forward, his weathered eyes narrowing. "Did you see that?" he asked Torres, who was already checking his own instruments. "The left hydraulic," Torres nodded, frowning. "Probably just a sensor glitch. Let me run diagnostics." He initiated the system check, and for a moment both pilots relaxed slightly. False alarms happened sometimes. A sensor reading an anomaly that didn't actually exist. It was usually nothing. But then the pressure dropped again. This time it didn't recover. "That's not a glitch," Mitchell said quietly, his voice dropping to the calm, controlled tone he used in emergencies. The training was kicking in now, the part of his brain that had been engineered for this exact scenario. "Left hydraulic is losing pressure. Check for leaks." Torres' hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, pulling up the system's display. They both stared at the screens, watching as the pressure continued its slow, inexorable descent. No indication of a leak, Torres said, his own voice tightening. Pressure's just dropping, like someone's opening a valve. That's impossible, Mitchell muttered, but even as he said it, he knew better than to dismiss the impossible. The instruments were telling him something was happening that shouldn't be able to happen. Hydraulic systems didn't just lose pressure on their own. There had to be a cause. Then the right hydraulic indicator flickered. No, 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 Mitchell breathed. Not both. He initiated emergency procedures, his movements becoming more deliberate, more focused. Get me the maintenance logs for this aircraft, he commanded, knowing even as he did that it wouldn't matter. The pre-flight checks had shown everything was perfect. Nothing had been wrong 4 hours ago. The right hydraulic pressure dropped. Then the center hydraulic system came online, and both pilots felt their stomachs tighten. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was systematic. This was cascading. It was as if someone or something was deliberately shutting down every hydraulic system the aircraft possessed, one after another, in careful sequence. "Captain, we need to declare an emergency," Torres said, his voice cracking slightly. Mitchell's hand was already on the radio. "Denver Center, this is United 447. We're experiencing multiple system failures." He paused, trying to find the words to describe something that defied explanation. "Left hydraulic is offline. Right hydraulic is offline. Center hydraulic is failing. All 3 systems are experiencing pressure loss, and I'm not reading any mechanical failures or leaks. I need immediate vectoring to the nearest suitable airport." The response from air traffic control was immediate but confused. "United 447, say again your system status. You're reporting 3 hydraulic failures." "Affirmative," Mitchell confirmed, his jaw clenched. "And it's not mechanical. Something's wrong here. This plane will crash unless we figure out what's happening. Stand by." He cut the radio transmission and looked at Torres. For the first time in 28 years, Captain James Mitchell felt genuine fear. Not panic, never panic, not when 246 lives depended on him staying focused, but a deep, primal fear that came from facing the unknown. The instruments continued their silent, damning cascade of failures. And somewhere in the cabin behind them, none of the 246 passengers had any idea that their lives were being measured in minutes. The intercom crackled to life with a sound that should have been routine. The captain updating passengers on flight progress or weather conditions. Instead, what emerged from the speakers was something that would haunt every person aboard Flight 447 for the rest of their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell." The voice was controlled, professionally calm, but underneath that measured tone was something unmistakable, urgency bordering on dread. "We are experiencing some technical difficulties at this time. I need everyone to remain calm and in your seats. Flight attendants will be coming through the cabin shortly with additional instructions." Technical difficulties. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then it erupted. A woman in seat 12C, Jennifer Hartley, a business consultant from Indianapolis, was the first to scream. Not a scream of pain, but of pure existential terror. "Oh my God," she gasped, clutching the armrest so hard her knuckles turned white. "Oh my God, we're going to crash. We're going to die. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." Her screams were contagious. Like a ripple spreading through water, panic began to consume the cabin. A man in first class stood up abruptly, his briefcase tumbling into the aisle. "What does he mean, technical difficulties?" he shouted. "What kind of technical difficulties? Planes don't have technical difficulties. Planes just fly." "Everyone please remain calm," called out Sarah Chen, the lead flight attendant, her voice competing against the growing chaos. She and her 3 colleagues had been trained for this exact scenario, though the training never quite prepared you for the reality of human panic. Sarah's hands trembled as she unbuckled her jumpseat and moved into the cabin, her professional smile now a grimace of forced composure. A young mother in row 8, Michelle Torres, pulled her 8-year-old daughter close to her chest. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though the words felt like lies even as she spoke them. Her daughter, Sophia, looked up at her with eyes wide and frightened. "Mommy, are we going to crash?" The question was so innocent, so direct, that Michelle felt her heart crack. She couldn't answer. She couldn't lie, and she couldn't tell the truth. The plane lurched sharply to the left, and the terror intensified. Overhead bins rattled. A water bottle tumbled from an open compartment and struck a passenger in the shoulder. More screams erupted. A businessman in seat 15A, whose name was Robert Chen, no relation to the flight attendant, made a decision that was simultaneously brave and devastating. He pulled out his phone and called his wife. "Jennifer, it's me," he said, his voice shaking. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I love you. I love the kids. I need you to know that no matter what happens in the next few minutes, I love you so much." His wife's voice crackled through the phone, confused and frightened. "What are you talking about? What's happening?" "I don't know," Robert admitted, tears streaming down his face. "But the captain just said we're having technical difficulties and the plane is. Something's not right. I just needed you to know, in case." He couldn't finish the sentence. Around the cabin, similar scenes were unfolding. An elderly priest in seat 23B was praying quietly, his lips moving in silent supplication. A young couple on their honeymoon, who had been holding hands and laughing just minutes before, were now holding each other, their joy transformed into desperate fear. A teenager in the back of the plane had pulled out his headphones and was staring straight ahead, his face pale and blank with shock. Sarah Chen moved through the aisles with the kind of determination that came from professional training overriding personal terror. "Please, everyone, return to your seats," she called out, steadying a man who was trying to stand up in the middle of the aisle. "The captain has asked everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. This is for your safety." "Our safety," a woman shrieked from row 11. "Our safety from what? From the plane falling out of the sky?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. The plane shuddered again, and this time the motion was more pronounced. The cabin itself seemed to groan, metal stressed beyond its intended parameters. The sound sent fresh waves of panic through the passengers. A man in business class vomited into the barf bag, his body racked with sobs. The smell of sickness added a new layer to the sensory nightmare. Sarah caught sight of one of her fellow flight attendants, Marcus, and they exchanged a look of understanding. Both of them had spent years perfecting the art of projecting calm in emergency situations. Both of them had drilled for crashes that they prayed would never happen. But nothing could prepare you for the reality of 246 human beings confronting their own mortality in real time. A little boy, no more than 5 years old, in seat 6D began to cry, not the dramatic screams of the adults, but the profound, hopeless weeping of a child who sensed danger but couldn't understand it. His mother held him, singing softly to him, the way mothers have sung to their children through every crisis in human history. "Hush, my baby, don't you cry," she sang, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "Mama's here, baby. Mama's right here." The flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, trying to provide reassurance where they could. Sarah found herself holding the hand of an older woman who was hyperventilating. "Breathe with me," Sarah said, taking deep breaths herself. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're going to be okay. We're going to get through this." But even as she said it, Sarah didn't know if it was true. The instrument panel in the cockpit continued its ominous cascade of failures. The passengers didn't know the details of what was happening up front, but they knew something was catastrophically wrong. The plane had begun to descend slightly, and that descent, combined with the strange vibrations and the captain's cryptic warning, created a perfect storm of human terror. A man in the back of the plane stood up, his eyes wild. "I'm getting off this plane. I'm not staying here to die." He lunged toward the emergency exit, and 2 other passengers grabbed him, trying to restrain him as he fought against them. Flight attendants rushed to help, and eventually the man collapsed back into his seat, sobbing uncontrollably. The intercom crackled again. Captain Mitchell's voice returned, still controlled but with an edge of strain that hadn't been there before. "Cabin crew, secure the cabin for emergency descent." Those words, emergency descent, cemented the nightmare into reality. This wasn't a mechanical hiccup. This was a genuine crisis. And for the next few minutes, every person aboard Flight 447 faced the very real possibility that they would never see the ground again. As Sarah Chen rushed through the cabin trying to manage the cascading human crisis unfolding around her, her trained eyes were scanning constantly, a habit ingrained by years of emergency procedure training. Check seatbelts. Confirm everyone is seated. Look for potential hazards. Monitor passenger behavior. It was this last item that made her pause just for a moment near the front of the economy cabin. Seat 7A was occupied by a man who shouldn't exist. Sarah had been a flight attendant for 12 years, long enough to develop an almost supernatural ability to read people. She could spot the nervous flyer, the seasoned traveler, the business executive who'd slept in his clothes, the tourist fresh off a connection. But this man was something else entirely. While panic was literally consuming the cabin around him, people screaming, crying, praying, he sat in perfect stillness, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his seatbelt fastened properly. His dark eyes were fixed on the window, staring out at nothing in particular, and his expression was one of calm acceptance. The kind of acceptance that comes not from faith or courage, but from resignation. It was the wrongness of his calmness that unsettled Sarah. She had reviewed the boarding manifest at least 3 times during this flight. Her job required it. She needed to know who was on her plane, how many passengers, where they were seated, any special needs. Seat 7A should have been occupied by a Michael Patterson, a 63-year-old man from Colorado Springs traveling to visit his daughter. But the man staring out the window was perhaps 40, maybe younger, with dark hair and features that didn't match any description she'd memorized. Sarah's professional instinct screamed at her that something was wrong. She approached the seat slowly, her practiced flight attendant smile in place despite the terror thrumming through her veins. "Sir, I need to check your seatbelt," she said, knowing it was already fastened but needing an excuse to get a closer look at him, to confirm what her eyes were telling her. The man didn't turn to look at her. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. He simply continued staring out the window with the intensity of someone watching their own death unfold in slow motion. "Sir," Sarah repeated, her voice a bit sharper now. Around them, a woman was praying the rosary, her beads clicking rhythmically. Another passenger was trying unsuccessfully to stand, convinced he needed to do something, anything, to take control of the situation. Finally, the man turned. His eyes met Sarah's, and she felt something cold slide down her spine. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a sharp, focused clarity that seemed impossibly out of place in a cabin full of terrified people. His gaze held hers for exactly 3 seconds before he returned his attention to the window. He said nothing. "Your seatbelt is fine," Sarah heard herself say, though she hadn't meant to speak at all. She was trained to be authoritative in emergencies, to project confidence and control. But this man's silence somehow undermined all of that training. His refusal to engage, his absolute stillness in the face of chaos, was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Sarah excused herself and moved down the aisle, but her attention kept drifting back to seat 7A. She found herself watching him in her peripheral vision as she helped other passengers, as she reassured a young couple that everything would be fine, as she retrieved a blanket for an elderly man whose teeth were chattering from fear or cold, probably both. The man in 7A never moved, not once. When another bout of turbulence struck, nearly throwing Sarah into the lap of a businessman, the man in 7A remained motionless, unbothered, as though the aircraft's violent shuddering was of no consequence to him. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She went to the back of the plane where her colleague Marcus was helping a distressed passenger. "Marcus, I need to ask you something," she said quietly, pulling him aside. "Do you remember checking boarding passes this afternoon in Denver?" Marcus, who was 24 and had only been working for the airline for 8 months, frowned. "Yeah, I was at gate 12. Why?" "The man in seat 7A, do you remember checking his boarding pass?" Marcus's frown deepened. "Seat 7A, that was the older guy, right? Patterson or something." "That's what I thought," Sarah said. "But I'm looking at him right now and he's not an older man. He's young, maybe early 40s, dark hair. And he's just sitting there completely calm while everyone around him is losing their minds." "What?" Marcus's eyes widened. "That's not possible. I checked him on personally. Nice guy, said something about visiting his daughter." "Well, either we both checked the wrong person, or someone got on this plane that shouldn't have," Sarah said quietly, aware that her words sounded paranoid even to her own ears. But there was no other explanation. She'd watched the passenger manifest religiously throughout the flight, noting who was in which seat, who'd gotten up to use the restroom where everyone was. And she had no record of a young man in seat 7A. She excused herself and moved back toward the cockpit. She needed to warn Captain Mitchell about this anomaly, but the intercom was active with air traffic control communications, and there was no way to reach him discreetly without potentially alarming the passengers further. Instead, she positioned herself so she could keep an eye on seat 7A while still attending to other passengers. Over the next few minutes, Sarah watched the man with increasing intensity. He never called the call button. He never unbuckled his seatbelt. He never attempted to move about the cabin like some passengers in emergencies did. He simply sat there, perfectly composed, his eyes always either fixed on the window or closed in what might have been meditation or prayer or complete detachment from reality. And then, nearly 30 minutes after Captain Mitchell's initial warning, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. The man in seat 7A reached into the pocket of his jacket, slowly, deliberately, as though aware he was being watched, and withdrew a small device. It was no larger than a deck of cards, with a small screen that glowed with data. The man stared at it for a moment, his expression still serene, before returning it to his pocket. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She had no idea what that device was or what it meant, but her instincts, the same instincts that had made her a good flight attendant, that had allowed her to read people and situations, screamed that whatever was happening to Flight 447, it was connected to the man in seat 7A. She made her way to the cockpit door, her professional composure finally cracking, and prepared to share information that would fundamentally change everything about this crisis. The man in seat 7A wasn't a passenger experiencing turbulence. He was something far more dangerous. He was someone who knew exactly what was happening to this plane. The moment Captain Mitchell's voice crackled across the radio declaring a catastrophic emergency, alarms began wailing at the North American Aerospace Defense Command Center in Colorado Springs. Not the routine alerts that signaled equipment malfunctions or training scenarios, but the real thing, a commercial aircraft in genuine distress. Major Sarah Wilson had been a fighter pilot for 16 years. She'd logged over 4,000 hours in the F-22 Raptor, flown combat missions in 3 different continents, and developed the kind of instinctive piloting skills that could only come from years of pushing herself and her aircraft to the very edge of their capabilities. She was in the break room of the 19th Fighter Squadron when the klaxon sounded, the alarm that meant pilots were needed in the air now. She was moving before the sound had even finished echoing through the building. "Scramble, scramble, scramble," the controller's voice came through her headset as she sprinted toward the flight line. Around her, 3 other pilots were doing the same, their muscle memory from endless drills taking over. Gear up. Get to the aircraft. Get airborne. The specifics would come once they were in the air. Major Wilson threw herself into the cockpit of her F-22, her hands moving through the pre-flight checklist with the speed and precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Her crew chief, Sergeant Marcus Reynolds, was already standing by with a thumbs up. The engines roared to life, a sound that still gave Wilson a rush of adrenaline even after 16 years. This was what she lived for, the moment when training became reality, when the theoretical became immediate and visceral. Raptor 11 cleared for takeoff, the controller announced, and Wilson pushed the throttle forward. The F-22 accelerated down the runway, its engines producing enough thrust to overcome gravity and inertia, sending the sleek fighter aircraft screaming into the sky. Behind her, her wingman, Captain James Chen, was following in Raptor 12. The flight to intercept United 447 took less than 15 minutes. At March 1.6, the F-22s covered distance that would have taken the crippled commercial jet nearly an hour to traverse. As they approached the coordinates where the Boeing 777 should be, Wilson switched to the emergency frequency. United 447, this is Raptor 11. We have you visual, she transmitted, her voice calm and professional despite the urgency of the situation. We're coming alongside to assess your condition. Raptor 11, this is United 447 Captain Mitchell, came the response. Thank God, we're losing hydraulic systems. All 3 primary hydraulic circuits are failing and I can't determine the cause. Request immediate vectoring to nearest suitable airport. Wilson banked her F-22 hard to the right, bringing the fighter into a position where she could see the massive commercial aircraft. The Boeing 777 was noticeably lower than it should have been, still descending despite what she knew were desperate efforts to level out. It was a surreal image, the massive fuselage of the passenger jet silhouetted against the afternoon sky, and her tiny fighter alongside it like a remora attached to a whale. We have you visual, Captain Mitchell, Wilson confirmed. Stand by while we assess your system's status. But even as she was saying it, her eyes were picking up something unusual. Through the cockpit windows of the 777, she could see the instrument panel. It was difficult to make out details from her position, but she could see lights flickering, instruments that should have been stable suddenly going dark. It was a pattern, she realized. A deliberate pattern. 12, are you seeing this? She asked her wingman. Affirmative, came Chen's response. Those aren't random failures, that's cascading. That's like someone's turning systems off. The same realization struck Wilson simultaneously. We need to know about the passengers on that aircraft, she transmitted to United 447. Specifically, I need the passenger manifest, and I need you to tell me if anyone unusual boarded at Denver. There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough for Wilson to understand that Captain Mitchell was confused by the request. Raptor 11, I don't understand, Mitchell responded. Unusual how? This is a scheduled flight with normal passengers. Captain, we're reading secondary transmissions coming from inside your aircraft, Wilson interrupted, her voice still controlled but with an edge of urgency. Someone inside your plane is transmitting to systems that shouldn't be remotely accessible. Someone on your aircraft is actively sabotaging your flight systems. The silence that followed was deafening. Wilson could almost feel the shock reverberating through the radio waves. For a commercial pilot, learning that someone aboard your aircraft had deliberately caused the crisis you were facing was somehow worse than believing it was a mechanical failure. A mechanical failure was an enemy you could fight with training and procedure. Sabotage was intentional destruction. It was terrorism. Raptor 11, are you certain? Mitchell's voice had changed. The professional calm was still there, but underneath it was something darker. Fear, rage, probably both. We're reading encrypted communications on frequencies that are secured military channels, Wilson explained, already running through the implications. Someone with sophisticated electronic knowledge is using a device that shouldn't even exist, one that can remotely access aircraft systems. And based on the pattern of your failures, they're doing it systematically. They're not trying to destroy your aircraft immediately. They're disabling your systems in sequence, making it harder for you to respond. Jesus Christ, Mitchell breathed. Captain, we need passenger manifest information, Wilson repeated. Anyone who boarded at Denver that wasn't on the flight plan, anyone who seemed unusual, anyone who went near the cockpit or the electronics bays. There was a moment of silence as Mitchell communicated with his crew. Wilson and her wingman held their positions alongside the 777, the pilots of the commercial aircraft now faced with a different kind of nightmare. Not mechanical failure, sabotage. Someone aboard their aircraft wanted them dead, wanted all 246 people aboard dead, and they were executing that plan with cold, calculated precision. Raptor 11, we've just received a report from our cabin crew, Mitchell transmitted, and Wilson could hear the strain in his voice now. We have a passenger in seat 7A who shouldn't be on the manifest. Young male, dark hair, sitting perfectly calm while the entire cabin is in panic. Our flight attendant says he's holding some kind of electronic device. Wilson's jaw tightened. That's our saboteur. Captain Mitchell, we need to contain that passenger. I don't know what he's capable of, but given what we're seeing in your systems, he's extremely dangerous. The question is, do you trust us enough to let us help? The F-22s banked slightly, staying in formation with the descending Boeing 777. Inside the fighter cockpit, Major Sarah Wilson was running calculations in her head, descent rates, remaining altitude, distance to the nearest suitable airfield. They had maybe 40 minutes, possibly less, before Flight 447 would be too low and too damaged to recover. Everything depended on what happened next inside that aircraft. Captain James Mitchell had been flying for 28 years without ever truly breaking the cardinal rule. The pilot in command never leaves the cockpit during an emergency. The cockpit was the nerve center of the aircraft, the place where life-or-death decisions were made every second. Leaving his seat meant delegating control to his co-pilot, meant trusting someone else with the lives of 246 people when the situation was deteriorating by the minute. But he had to know, he had to see it for himself. David, you have the controls, Mitchell said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Maintain our current descent profile. Try to stabilize at 5,000 feet if you can. I'll be back in 2 minutes. Torres nodded, understanding without needing elaboration that something critical had driven his captain from the cockpit. Mitchell unfastened his seatbelt and stood, his legs steadier than he expected given the aircraft's unstable condition. He moved through the cockpit door and into the cabin, and what he saw was a portrait of human desperation. The cabin was a study in contrast. Some passengers had given up entirely, sitting slumped in their seats with the blank stare of people who'd already accepted death. Others were still fighting, praying, crying, calling loved ones on their phones, desperately grasping at hope. A flight attendant moved through the aisle, and when she saw Captain Mitchell, her eyes widened. She gestured urgently toward the front of the economy section. Mitchell moved forward, his captain's uniform and demeanor causing passengers to part slightly, as though his presence might offer some explanation for the catastrophe unfolding around them. And then he saw him. Seat 7A. The man was exactly as Sarah Chen had described, young, dark hair, composed in a way that was almost inhuman given the circumstances. But what struck Mitchell most was the device in the man's hands. It was sophisticated, expensive-looking, with a small screen displaying lines of code and data that made no sense to the captain but radiated purpose and intention. Mitchell's entire body went cold. You, he said, the single word carrying the weight of sudden, terrible understanding. You did this. The man in seat 7A looked up, and for the first time something flickered across his face. Not surprise, but recognition, like an actor acknowledging his cue. Captain Mitchell, the man said quietly, his voice carrying an accent that Mitchell couldn't quite place. Yes, I did this. The confession hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Around them, passengers began to notice that something was happening, that the captain was confronting someone, that there was more to this crisis than simple mechanical failure. "Why?" Mitchell demanded, though part of him already knew the answer. He was looking at a terrorist. He was looking at someone who had deliberately sabotaged his aircraft. "Because the world needs to see," the man replied, his dark eyes meeting Mitchell's with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. "Because people like me have been screaming for years and no one listens. Because your country breaks things, breaks countries, breaks families, breaks lives, and calls it foreign policy." Mitchell felt something shift in him. This wasn't political extremism he was looking at. This was grief. This was rage born from genuine pain. This was a human being who had decided that the only way to make people understand his suffering was to inflict suffering on others. "There are children on this plane," Mitchell said quietly. "I know," the man responded. And the way he said it, the weight in those two words, told Mitchell that yes, he knew, and it hadn't stopped him. "What's your name?" Mitchell asked, his mind already working through possibilities, through procedures, through the impossible situation he now found himself in. "Dr. Marcus Chen," the man replied. "I'm an aerospace engineer. I spent 15 years designing weapons. Beautiful, sophisticated systems that could bring down aircraft, disable defense networks, create chaos. I was very good at my work. The kind of work that governments pay billions for and then use against the people they're supposed to protect." Mitchell felt a chill run down his spine. An aerospace engineer. That explained the sophistication of whatever was happening to his aircraft systems. This wasn't someone who'd learned hacking from the internet. This was someone with legitimate, deep knowledge of aviation systems. "You boarded this plane planning to crash it," Mitchell said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Chen confirmed. "I boarded this plane planning to prove a point, to show the world how fragile the systems they depend on really are, to demonstrate that a single person with the right knowledge can take down an aircraft with 246 people aboard, to make them understand the price of their indifference." "And what changed?" Mitchell demanded, because something had changed. He could see it in Chen's face, in the way he'd confessed so readily. "You disabled my systems, but you haven't finished the job. You could have sent this aircraft into a dive. You could have completely severed all hydraulic power, but you haven't. So what changed?" For a long moment, Chen didn't answer. His eyes moved away from Mitchell's, drifting back to the window, to the sky that was getting steadily closer as the aircraft continued its descent toward Earth. "I saw a little girl," Chen finally said, his voice barely audible. "Maybe 5 years old. She was crying, asking her mother if they were going to die, and her mother was singing to her, actually singing. Not screaming, not praying, just singing softly to make her daughter feel safe in what might be her final moments." Chen's jaw clenched. "And I realized that I've become the thing I was fighting against. I've become someone who justifies the deaths of innocents in the name of a greater cause." Mitchell felt something shift in his chest. This man was a saboteur, a terrorist, but he was also capable of remorse. He was capable of seeing the humanity in his victims and being shattered by it. "Can you fix it?" Mitchell asked. "The systems you damaged?" "Some of them," Chen said. "Not all. The damage is extensive, but the device I have, it can override the corrupted circuits, reroute power, work around the sabotaged systems. It won't restore full functionality, but it might be enough. It might give you enough control to land this aircraft safely." "Why would you do that?" Mitchell demanded. "You came aboard planning mass murder." "Because," Chen said, turning his dark eyes back to the captain's face, "I'm not a murderer. I'm a weapon that's finally realized what it was forged to do was wrong. And maybe, just maybe, there's still time to make different choices." Mitchell stood there, staring at the man who had nearly killed everyone aboard Flight 447, and saw something he hadn't expected to see. Genuine remorse. Genuine transformation. The question was whether he could trust it, whether he could risk the lives of 246 people on the word of a man who, minutes ago, had been deliberately destroying their aircraft. The answer came from Major Wilson's voice crackling through his headset. "We're reading secondary transmissions stabilizing your systems. Someone's fighting against the sabotage from inside. Captain, whoever that is, they might be saving your aircraft." Mitchell made his decision. "Show me," he said to Chen. "Show me how to do this. Show me how to save this plane." Cockpit door had never felt heavier as Captain Mitchell ushered Dr. Marcus Chen through it. Co-pilot David Torr's eyes widened in shock and something close to rage when he realized who was being brought into the command center of the aircraft. "Captain, what the hell?" Torr started, his hand still gripping the control yoke. "David, stand down," Mitchell commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a captain in crisis. "This man is going to help us save this aircraft. We don't have time for anything else." Chen moved to the center console with the confidence of someone who'd studied these systems intimately. His fingers flew across the device he was holding, his eyes scanning the instrument panel before him. The Boeing 777 systems displayed a nightmare scenario: hydraulic pressure at critical levels, backup systems either offline or unreliable, and the primary flight computers struggling to maintain any kind of stable flight path. "How much time do we have?" Chen asked, his earlier confession replaced by the sharp, focused tone of an engineer in problem-solving mode. 30 minutes to the nearest suitable landing site," Mitchell replied, checking his calculations. "Maybe 40 if we're lucky and the damage hasn't gotten worse." "It will get worse," Chen said bluntly, "because I programmed it to get worse. The malware in your systems is designed to cascade failures. Each system that goes offline creates stress on the remaining systems, pushing them toward failure. It's elegant, actually. Devastating, but elegant." Torres made a sound of disgust, but Mitchell held up a hand to silence him. They didn't need judgment right now. They needed solutions. "Tell me about yourself," Mitchell said, surprising himself with the question. But something told him that understanding who this man was, what had brought him to this moment, was crucial to understanding whether he could actually be trusted. Chen's fingers continued working, lines of code scrolling across his device's screen, but his voice took on a distant quality. "My wife's name was Lynn. My daughter was Sophia. She was 7 years old, bright, beautiful, wanted to be an astronaut." He paused, his jaw tightening. "There was a military intervention in my home country. Officially, there was no military intervention. Officially, it was a humanitarian operation. But the drones came anyway. The precision strikes came anyway." "Where was home?" Mitchell asked. "It doesn't matter," Chen said. "Somewhere that nobody in America cares about. Somewhere where collateral damage is acceptable. My family was collateral damage. A miscalculation. A wrong address. Lynn and Sophia were killed along with 37 other civilians in what was called a targeted strike against terrorist infrastructure. The infrastructure was my neighbor's garage where he worked on car repairs." The words hung in the cockpit like a funeral dirge. Mitchell could feel Tor's rage transforming into something more complicated, still anger, but now tinged with understanding. "I spent years grieving," Chen continued, his hands never stopping their work. "Years trying to make sense of a senseless loss, and then I got angry, truly angry. I decided that if my country, the country that killed my family without consequence, valued the lives of its citizens so little, then perhaps I should make them understand the value. Perhaps I should take something from them. Perhaps I should make them feel what I felt." "So you became a weapon," Mitchell said. "So I became a weapon," Chen echoed. "I used my education, my knowledge, my expertise, and I designed systems that could kill thousands. I sold those designs. I watched governments buy them, integrate them into their arsenals. I told myself it was justice. I told myself it was balance, but it was just more death, just more grief being manufactured, more families being destroyed the way mine was destroyed." He turned to face Mitchell, his dark eyes reflecting the glow of the instrument panel. "And then I decided to prove something. I decided to take down an American aircraft with 246 people aboard. I would be the voice of the voiceless. I would make people understand the price of their apathy. I would create a tragedy big enough that people would have to notice. What changed? Mitchell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. A little girl singing, Chen said simply. That's all it took. A mother singing to her daughter, a simple act of love in the face of death. And I realized that what I was about to do, murdering 246 people, many of them innocent, many of them people just trying to get home, wasn't justice. It was exactly what I claimed to hate about the world. It was the same indifference to human life that had killed my family. He turned back to the console. The irony is perfect, isn't it? The weapon realized it was forged for the wrong purpose. The saboteur became the savior. If I can fix what I broke, maybe, just maybe, it means something. Maybe it means my daughter would have approved. The device in Chen's hands beeped, and his fingers moved faster. I'm accessing your backup systems now, trying to bypass the corrupted main circuits. The damage is severe, but there's a redundancy built into this aircraft that's going to save your lives. The designers of the 777 anticipated catastrophic failures. There are multiple layers of backup systems, multiple ways to fly this aircraft even when primary systems fail. Can you stabilize the hydraulics? Torres asked, his earlier hostility replaced by desperate hope. Not completely, Chen admitted, but I can reroute enough pressure to give you control surfaces. You'll have limited maneuverability, but you'll have some. And most importantly, I can stabilize your descent rate. Right now you're losing altitude too fast. If you hit the ground at this rate, even with a perfect landing, the impact will be catastrophic. Mitchell leaned over the console, watching as Chen worked. Line by line, he was fighting against the very sabotage he'd programmed into the aircraft. It was surreal, watching the architect of their destruction become their salvation. How did you get the device on the plane? Torres asked. How did you get past security? Federal ID, Chen said. I created a legitimate-looking Federal Aviation Administration credentials package. I walked through security, boarded as a random passenger, and carried my device with me. Nobody was looking for an aerospace engineer carrying sophisticated electronics. They were looking for weapons. They were looking for bombs. The aircraft lurched, and alarms screamed in the cockpit. But Chen's hands remained steady on his device, and within seconds the violent motion stilled slightly. There, Chen said. Main hydraulic reroute is online. You're stabilizing. Descent rate is improving. Mitchell glanced at his instruments and saw that Chen was right. The rate of descent, while still concerning, had improved dramatically. They still had maybe 15 minutes of falling, but it was controlled falling now. Managed descent rather than catastrophic plunge. Thank you, Mitchell said quietly. Don't thank me, Chen replied. Not yet. Not until all 246 people on this aircraft are safely on the ground. I'm the reason they were ever in danger. Saving them is the minimum requirement for redemption, and I'm not sure redemption is even possible for what I've done. But his eyes were fixed on the screens in front of him, watching the data, ready to adjust his device at a moment's notice. He had saved them once. Now he just had to keep them saved. Outside the cockpit windows, the ground was getting closer. The landing site was only 15 minutes away now. 15 minutes. After that, it would all be over. After that, they would know if Dr. Marcus Chen's redemption had truly begun. The descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport should have been routine. Thousands of aircraft made this approach every single day, guided by the same instrument landing system, controlled by the same air traffic controllers, navigating the same invisible pathways through the sky that had been established decades ago. But Flight 447 was not a routine aircraft, and this was not a routine descent. Captain Mitchell gripped the control yoke with white knuckles, his senses hyper-alert to every vibration, every small correction the aircraft made. The hydraulic pressure had stabilized thanks to Chen's work, but it was a fragile stability. One more system failure, one more cascade of problems, and 246 people would become a statistic in aviation history. Descent rate nominal, co-pilot Torres reported, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure they were all under. Altitude 3,000 feet. Chicago approach. United 447 continuing descent for landing on runway 27 left. United 447, Chicago approach, you're cleared for landing, came the calm response from the tower. But there was an edge to the controller's voice, an awareness that this wasn't a normal arrival. Every available emergency vehicle at O'Hare had been alerted. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue personnel stood ready on the tarmac, prepared for the worst. In the cabin behind them, passengers were beginning to sense that something had changed. The violent shaking had stopped. The alarms that had been screaming had quieted. The plane was still descending, still moving toward Earth, but it was doing so in a controlled manner rather than a death plunge. A woman near the front of the cabin started crying, not screams of terror, but tears of relief. Her sobs triggered something in the other passengers, and soon nearly everyone was crying, praying, expressing gratitude for what appeared to be a reprieve from death. Sarah Chen, the flight attendant, found herself gripping the armrest so hard her hand was shaking. She'd known from the beginning that something was wrong, that the man in seat 7A was the key to everything. But she never could have predicted this outcome, that the saboteur would become the savior, that his device would be used to fight against his own sabotage, that they would actually make it to the ground alive. 2,000 feet. The ground was becoming visible now, the sprawl of suburban Chicago, the roads and buildings growing larger with each passing second. Mitchell could see the runway in the distance, could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the taxiway. The landing gear was down, one of the few systems that had remained uncompromised and locked in place. All they needed now was to bring this massive aircraft down safely. 1,500 feet, Torres called out. Descent rate 300 feet per minute, slight crosswind from the northwest. Dr. Chen sat rigid in the jump seat behind them, his device still in his hands, still ready to make adjustments if needed. His face was pale, and there was a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there during the technical work. Now that they were close to actually succeeding, now that survival had shifted from impossible dream to possible reality, the enormity of what he'd almost done was beginning to hit him. 1,000 feet. Mitchell adjusted the control yoke slightly, feeling the aircraft respond. It was sluggish. The limited hydraulic pressure made the controls heavy, requiring more effort to maneuver. But they were responding. The aircraft was listening to him. That was all he needed. 750 feet, Torres continued his countdown. Clear to land. Mitchell could see individual cars now on the roads below. He could see the runways clearly, could see the emergency vehicles with their lights flashing red and blue, creating a kaleidoscope pattern on the tarmac. This was going to work. Against all odds, against sabotage and failure and the cruel indifference of chance, this was going to work. 500 feet. The aircraft was stable. The descent rate was perfect. The wind was cooperating. Every variable that had been screaming against them had somehow, miraculously, aligned in their favor. 200 feet. Mitchell could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He'd landed thousands of times, in various aircraft, in various weather conditions, in various states of mechanical distress. But he'd never felt this. This combination of fear and hope, of responsibility and grace. 100 feet. The runway was rushing toward them now, and in his peripheral vision, Mitchell saw Torres crossing himself in a small gesture of prayer. 50 feet. The wheels touched down. For a moment, there was a strange silence, the moment between impact and reality. Then the aircraft was on the ground, rolling, still moving at significant speed but decelerating. The reverse thrusters engaged, adding additional braking, and Mitchell felt the entire aircraft shudder as it fought against inertia. The wheels stayed on the runway. The aircraft continued to slow, continued to move in a straight line down the center of the landing strip. And with each second that passed, with each meter of runway they consumed, the probability of survival increased exponentially. The aircraft came to a complete stop. For a moment, nobody in the cockpit moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. They had done it. Against the odds, against a determined saboteur and cascading system failures and the raw cruelty of chance, they had brought 246 people safely to the ground. Then Torres started laughing. Not mocking laughter, but the release of impossible tension, the sound of a human being who had just been given back his life and couldn't quite process the gratitude. Mitchell's hands were shaking as he reached for the radio. Chicago Tower, United 447, we are down. The response came back immediately, and there was something different in the controller's voice now. Relief, amazement, professional joy. United 447, welcome to the ground. Emergency services are responding to your location. Outside, firefighting trucks were already moving toward them, their lights painting the evening sky in patterns of red and blue. Emergency personnel stood ready, prepared for any contingency. The moment the aircraft came to a complete stop and the doors could be safely opened, they would pour in, assessing the situation, beginning the process of evacuation. But first, there was one thing that had to happen. Federal agents were already boarding through the front stairs, moving with purpose toward the cockpit. They knew exactly who they were looking for. They knew exactly what had happened, and they knew exactly what needed to happen next. Chen stood calmly as the agents entered the cockpit, his device already disconnected from the aircraft's systems, sitting inert in his hands. He made no attempt to run, made no attempt to resist. He simply held out his hands as the agents approached, accepting the handcuffs with the resigned expression of a man who had made peace with his fate. Dr. Marcus Chen, one of the agents said, reading from a document, you are under arrest for acts of terrorism, sabotage, and conspiracy to commit mass murder. As they led him away, Chen turned back to look at Captain Mitchell one final time. Their eyes met, and in that moment something passed between them, not forgiveness, not absolution, but mutual acknowledgement of what had occurred. A saboteur had become a rescuer. A terrorist had become a hero. A man had chosen redemption in the moment when it mattered most. The rest, as they would say, was history. The trial of Dr. Marcus Chen lasted 4 months. It was the largest terrorism trial the United States had seen since 9/11, with media outlets dedicating enormous resources to covering every aspect of the case. The prosecution painted a clear picture. A dangerous ideologue who had deliberately sabotaged a commercial aircraft with the intention of killing 246 people as a political statement. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was recorded. The technical sabotage was undeniable. But the defense painted a different picture. They presented Chen not as an unrepentant terrorist, but as a victim of circumstance, a grieving man whose loss had been weaponized by his own intelligence and expertise. They showed the drone strike footage, the confirmation that his family had indeed been killed in a military operation, that Lin and Sophia Chen had been casualties of what was officially called collateral damage. They presented psychological evaluations, suggesting that Chen's mental state had been deteriorating for years, that his planning of the attack had been a symptom of deep trauma rather than calculated villainy. And most powerfully, they presented testimony from the passengers of Flight 447. The young mother who had sung to her daughter testified about seeing Chen in the courtroom, about how his transformation from saboteur to rescuer had given her a new understanding of human complexity. She spoke about how she wanted him punished. Yes, absolutely. But also about how his last-minute choice to save them rather than destroy them deserved to be part of his story. Her daughter, now 8 years old, was in the gallery, and the image of the child who should have died testifying to a jury about forgiveness was powerful enough to move even the hardened journalists watching the trial. Captain James Mitchell testified about the 30-minute conversation with Chen in the cockpit, about the moment he decided to trust a confessed saboteur with the lives of 246 people. He spoke about the courage it took to change one's mind, to move from murder to redemption, even in the face of certain imprisonment. "I've been flying for 30 years," Mitchell told the jury, "and I've never seen anything as brave as what Dr. Chen did in those final minutes of our descent." He could have disappeared. He could have claimed he was a passenger who saw what was happening and tried to help. Instead, he confessed completely and used his knowledge to save the very people he'd tried to kill. That's not the action of an unrepentant terrorist. That's the action of someone who finally saw clearly what he'd become and chose to be different. The jury deliberated for 2 weeks. In the end, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: terrorism, sabotage, attempted mass murder. But the jury's recommendation for sentencing was less harsh than the prosecution had sought. 30 years, not life. 30 years, which meant that someday, if Chen lived long enough and earned it through behavior, parole would be possible. The courtroom erupted when the sentence was announced. Some passengers of Flight 447 wept. Some nodded, satisfied with justice. Chen himself showed no reaction, simply accepting the sentence with the same resignation with which he'd accepted his arrest. But the trial was only the beginning of Flight 447's legacy. Within weeks of the landing, congressional hearings had been scheduled. The revelation that a commercial aircraft systems could be so comprehensively compromised by a single person with the right expertise sent shockwaves through the aerospace industry. How many other vulnerabilities existed? How many other aircraft could be sabotaged? The American public, already anxious about flying, became actively terrified. Captain Mitchell was asked to testify before Congress. He arrived in Washington wearing his uniform, sitting at a table with aerospace engineers, FAA officials, and representatives of major aircraft manufacturers. For 3 days, he answered questions about Flight 447, about the systems that had failed, about the protocols that hadn't prevented the sabotage. "The truth," Mitchell said at one point, "is that we designed these systems 50 years ago. We made them as secure as we could with the technology that existed then. But technology has advanced. Threats have evolved. Our security protocols have not kept pace with the actual danger. And that's not anyone's fault in particular. It's a collective failure. We as an industry have been complacent." His testimony sparked a revolution in aviation security. Congress allocated $5 billion to aerospace security upgrades. Manufacturers implemented new protocols for securing aircraft computer systems. Universities began training a new generation of aerospace security specialists. The industry that had been complacent about cybersecurity suddenly treated it as a priority on par with structural engineering. The changes that came from the tragedy of Flight 447 ultimately saved lives. Industry experts estimated that the security vulnerabilities exposed by Chen's attack could have been exploited to bring down multiple aircraft over the following decades. Instead, they were addressed. The systems were hardened. The protocols were strengthened. But perhaps the most remarkable outcome of the Flight 447 crisis came 6 years after Chen's conviction. President Elizabeth Warren, after reviewing Chen's prison record, 6 years of perfect behavior, of helping other inmates, of volunteering in the prison education program, decided to commute his sentence. The announcement shocked the nation. Some passengers of Flight 447 felt betrayed. Others felt that redemption deserved to be honored. Chen was released under strict conditions. He would be under house arrest for 5 years, would be monitored constantly, and would forfeit all rights to profit from his story. But he was released. And within weeks, he was hired by the FAA as a consultant. It was a controversial decision, but it was also brilliant. Who better to help design security systems to prevent sabotage than someone who understood sabotage at the deepest level? Chen spent the next 5 years working with engineers at the FAA, designing security protocols, identifying vulnerabilities, testing systems. He became one of the most important voices in aviation security, a redemption story that even his harshest critics had to acknowledge contained some poetic truth. 20 years after Flight 447, Captain James Mitchell retired from commercial aviation. He was invited to speak at universities, at aviation safety conferences, at corporate leadership seminars. He always spoke about the same theme: human complexity. How a person could be both victim and perpetrator, both villain and hero. How trauma could transform someone into a weapon, but how consciousness and compassion could transform that weapon back into something approaching human again. Dr. Chen lived quietly after his house arrest ended. He never married again, never had children to replace the family he'd lost. He continued working as an aviation security consultant, and by all accounts, he was brilliant at it. But he remained a haunted figure, a man who carried the weight of having nearly caused one of the greatest tragedies in aviation history. In interviews, when asked how he lived with what he'd almost done, Chen would say, "Every day I wake up and I remember that 246 people should be dead. That little girl who asked her mother if we were going to crash. She's 15 years old now, probably thinking about college, about boys, about her future. That future shouldn't exist. But it does, because I changed my mind for 30 minutes. Every day of her life that she lives, every accomplishment she achieves, that's because in those final moments I chose differently. That's my redemption. That's what I live for." Flight 447 became more than a story about a near disaster. It became a story about human transformation, about the possibility of redemption, about the idea that even our darkest moments can be transformed into something meaningful if we have the courage to see clearly and choose differently. The passengers who survived that flight lived with the knowledge that they had been given a second chance, and they spent their lives trying to honor that gift.